They called security on her before she even said a word. No warning, no explanation, just two officers summoned like backup, walking straight toward a black woman standing in line with a first-class boarding pass in her hand. The gate agent didn't even glance at the ticket. Didn't need to. "Ma'am, step aside." That was all. For words, spoken with the kind of finality reserved for trespassers, not travelers. And as she was quietly pulled from the queue, eyes followed. But not in protest, just in confirmation. Because to them, she didn't look like someone who belonged in seat 1D. Not with that skin, not with that silence, not with that calm. But here's the part no one knew. Not the flight staff. Not the supervisor grinning smugly by the kiosk. And certainly not the man who walked through after her without so much as a glance at his ID. The woman they just tried to remove didn't buy the ticket to first class. She bought something else. Something bigger. And when you find out what it is, you'll understand why no one on that Starglide air flight to Los Angeles ever flew the same again. This isn't a story about race. This is a story about power. The kind you never see coming. The kind they didn't see standing right in front of them. So now ask yourself, what happens when the person you try to silence turns out to own the silence itself? Who is she? Why didn't she fight back? And what did she come here to do? The sun hadn't fully risen over the San Diego basin when Nia Thompson arrived at the terminal. It was 5:43 a.m., early even by airport standards. But the line for priority access was already forming. Nia stood slightly apart from it, not quite in the queue but close enough to count. She wore a navy blue hoodie and jeans, hair pulled into a low bun, a canvas tote slung over one shoulder. In her right hand, a digital boarding pass glowed faintly. A man in a business suit stepped ahead of her, glancing once at her screen before returning to his own. She didn't react, didn't correct him, just stepped forward calmly when the agent called next. "Last name?" the agent asked, not looking up. "Thompson." The agent tapped, paused, then frowned slightly. "This says first class." Nia nodded once. "Do you have ID?" She handed it over wordlessly. The agent took a moment too long, then nodded, handed everything back, and gestured her through. No apology, no smile, just a shrug that said, "You can go, for now." The security line was less forgiving. A second glance at her tote, a third at her hair, random screening, swab and pat down. "Just protocol," they said. She nodded, didn't flinch. She'd flown enough to know what that word really meant. Inside the terminal, the waiting area for Gate 7 was mostly empty. She found a seat near the window, tucked her tote beneath it, and pulled out a book. But she didn't open it. Instead, she watched the tarmac. A catering truck backed away from the plane. A luggage cart rumbled by. Nothing unusual. And yet, she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. 20 minutes later, the gate agent approached again. "Ms. Thompson." She looked up. "We're confirming boarding order. You're in seat 1D, correct?" "Yes." Another pause, then a thin smile. "We'll call you shortly." When boarding began, she stood with the other priority passengers. The first-class line moved slow. She waited, then stepped forward. That's when the two security officers approached. Not fast, not loud, just direct. "Ma'am," one said, "please step aside." She blinked. "Is there a problem?" "No, ma'am. We've just been asked to verify something with you before boarding." The line stalled. Eyes turned. A man behind her coughed deliberately, as if to clear the moment. But no one intervened. Nia stepped aside. The officer gestured toward a side door. "This way, please." She glanced once toward the jet bridge, then followed without a word. The agent barely looked at her boarding pass before gesturing to the side. "Security will assist you," he said without meeting her eyes. Nia felt her fingers tighten slightly around the strap of her tote. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded anything. She was in line. In line, on time, with a verified booking and the kind of patience worn only by those who've had to carry it often. A murmur passed behind her. Not surprise, not protest. Just that quiet rustle of people reordering their assumptions. like her presence had been an error in their mental seating chart and this moment was the correction. Security didn't move fast. They didn't have to. Their uniforms were enough. As they reached her, one officer asked for her ID. The other stayed close as if she might bolt. Nia didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her state ID, and handed it over. The officer scanned it quickly, tapped a few things on a small handheld screen, then looked up. "Please come with us, ma'am." "Am I under arrest?" "No, ma'am. We just need to verify something with our operations desk." "What exactly needs verifying?" The officer hesitated. "There's been a flag on your reservation. We're just trying to clear it." She nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in recognition. This wasn't her first flag. It wouldn't be her last. As they walked through the terminal, past families hugging, business travelers tapping on phones, flight crews exchanging silent nods, Nia noticed how no one looked directly at her. They looked at the uniformed men, at the tote, at the potential disruption. Not at her. Never at her. She was escorted down a narrow corridor marked "Staff Only." The walls were painted beige, scuffed at ankle level. The ceiling buzzed faintly with fluorescent light. A cleaning cart stood unattended near a door marked "Operations, Clearance Only." Inside, the room was small. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a monitor mounted high on the wall showing looping security footage. An agent in a dark gray polo tapped on a keyboard, his badge reading "Internal Compliance." "Ms. Thompson," he said as she entered, "we have a minor inconsistency on your profile." "Inconsistency?" she repeated. "Yes, it appears your ticket was flagged as a courtesy upgrade from a loyalty voucher. But that voucher source is no longer recognized under our current program terms." Nia didn't sit. She stood, one hand resting on her tote. "I didn't use a voucher," she said. "The reservation was processed through an investment holding protocol under Starglide's Institutional Asset Trust." The man blinked, then squinted at the monitor. "It's not showing that here." "Of course it's not," she said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to." Nia didn't flinch as she stepped onto the jet bridge. The air was cooler here, a thin corridor of silence before the hum of the aircraft. She kept her tote tucked close, the envelope inside pressing against her side like a reminder. The metal bridge groaned faintly underfoot. A couple ahead of her moved slowly, blocking the path, but Nia didn't attempt to pass. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't here to hurry. The first-class cabin welcomed her with soft lighting and hushed voices. No music, no chatter, just the smooth hum of conditioned air and distant instructions from flight attendants. She reached row 2, slid into seat 2A, and placed the envelope gently into the seat pocket in front of her. She leaned back slowly, aware of how every movement would be watched, if not openly, then through side glances and unspoken assessments. The man beside her gave a curt nod and returned to scrolling through his tablet. He didn't ask questions, didn't introduce himself. That was fine. Nia wasn't here to make friends. Overhead bins closed with muted thuds. The door sealed with a hiss, and the aircraft began its slow reverse. The cabin crew moved with practiced fluidity, passing out water and menus, though not to her row. Row 1, yes. Row 3, too. But not hers. Nia noted it but said nothing. She simply adjusted the seatbelt and turned her gaze out the window. Sloane walked past again, her eyes skimming over Nia like a barcode that hadn't scanned. There was a calm calculation in it. Nia didn't meet her gaze. She didn't need to. She felt the plane shift into taxi. The weight of takeoff built steadily in the floor. As the engines roared and lifted them skyward, she allowed her breathing to slow, the tension tucked behind her ribs still coiled. This wasn't fear. It was preparation. She watched the clouds peel back and reshape. She had taken this route once before, years ago, when she was younger, flying cross-country for her grandmother's funeral. That flight had taught her something. The world wouldn't hand you respect just because you showed up. You had to wait for it to be withheld, endure its absence, and sometimes, even then, still never receive it. She had remembered that lesson ever since. Now, on this Starglide air flight to San Diego, seat 2A, A black woman with a sealed envelope rested in first class, not because she'd earned the upgrade, but because she owned the seat, owned the silence, owned what came next, and nobody here knew what was coming. Nia sat in seat 2A, her tote tucked beneath the seat in front of her, the envelope inside pressing lightly against the canvas. The hum of the cabin grew louder as more passengers boarded. She kept her posture relaxed, one hand resting on her lap, the other lightly holding the boarding stub. Around her, other travelers settled in. Laptops opened, jackets folded, seatbelt clicks. It was a normal morning flight, or at least it was pretending to be. She could feel it before she saw it. The attention. Not the kind that was overt, but the subtle kind, the glance too long kind, the sideways look then look away kind. It didn't come from everyone. Just enough to make the air shift. Just enough to remind her what space she occupied. Sloane passed her row. The flight attendant's stride was brisk, her bun tight, her smile missing. She looked at Nia's seat for just half a second too long. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just long enough for Nia to mark it. The man beside her adjusted his tablet and asked Sloane for headphones. She obliged him with a polite tone, then turned away. Not once did she address Nia. Nia didn't need her to. Not yet. She reached for her seatbelt, clicked it into place, and looked out the window. A ground crewman jogged by below, signaling to another. She could see the ramp agent loading bags. Among them, hers. The tote was small and light, but the envelope inside was not. Not in meaning. The captain came on the speaker with a flat greeting, the kind meant to inspire calm. Weather would be clear all the way to San Diego. Flight time just under 6 hours. Nothing unusual, but Nia felt the weight in the air. When Sloane returned down the aisle with the manifest, she paused again at Nia's row. This time, she frowned just slightly, eyes flicking to the boarding stub in Nia's hand, then to her face, then back to the manifest. She said nothing and moved on. Nia turned her head slightly and caught the eye of a man in 1C, a middle-aged passenger who gave her a quick nod, then looked away. She recognized that nod. I saw it too, but I'm not getting involved nod. The plane door closed with a pneumatic hiss. The jet bridge withdrew. The lights in the cabin dimmed. And still, Sloane had not offered Nia a pre-departure drink. The rows around her had glasses with water or juice. Her tray remained closed. She looked at it for a moment, then let it be. As the plane began taxiing, Sloane leaned in to a fellow flight attendant and whispered something. The other woman looked past Sloane's shoulder, eyes landing briefly on Nia, then down again. Nia caught it. Every micro-expression, every silent confirmation, every measure of doubt passed through coded gestures. The plane lifted from the ground in a smooth arc. The city below peeled away. Nia sat back, resting her head on the seat. The hum of the engines grew steadier, and for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe. But she didn't let go of the envelope. Not entirely. She'd been in rooms like this before, cabins like this, situations like this, and she knew that it wasn't always the announcement that mattered. It was the arrangement, the choreography of silence, the polite exclusion, the institutional shrug that came dressed in service uniforms. And so far, all signs pointed to the dance starting again. About 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights came up. Sloane moved through the first-class rows with a tray of warm towels. She handed one to the man in 2B, then stepped past without so much as a glance toward Nia. Nia didn't stop her. She didn't need to. Moments later, Sloane returned to offer drinks. Sparkling water, orange juice, coffee. Again, 2B was served. Nia was not addressed. The man in 2B hesitated, looked between Sloane and Nia, then said quietly, "Excuse me, could she get something too?" Sloane turned. "What?" He gestured slightly. She didn't get a towel either. Sloane's expression barely shifted. "I'll check." She walked away. Nia kept her eyes forward, expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time she'd been made into an afterthought, and it wouldn't be the last. The performance was familiar, but it still cost energy. A few minutes later, Sloane returned, this time with a different tray. Would you like something to drink, Miss Thompson? She asked flatly. Water, please. Sloane poured it into a plastic cup and handed it over without eye contact. She didn't say you're welcome when Nia said thank you. It was all so quiet, so seamless. If anyone had looked up for just a moment, they might have thought it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Later, when the snack basket came around, Nia reached for a protein bar. Sloane stopped her hand lightly, not forcefully, just enough to say, don't. Her voice was low. Those are for premium passengers, ma'am. Nia blinked once. I'm in seat 2A. There was a manifest correction. I'm sure you understand. She withdrew her hand without arguing. But her heart beat louder in her ears. She waited 10 minutes. Then buzzed the call light. Sloane appeared, a touch of irritation hiding behind her practiced face. Yes. I'd like to speak with the cabin manager. Is there an issue? You know there is. Sloane didn't answer. She turned and left. 3 minutes later, a man in a navy blazer appeared. He didn't sit. He crouched slightly, holding the bulkhead for balance. I understand there's a concern, Miss Thompson. There's a pattern. He said nothing. Nia held his eyes. I booked this ticket through a firm affiliated with Starglide's strategic branch. It was issued properly. The treatment I've received since boarding has not been in alignment with your airline's stated policies for first class. The man nodded slowly. I'm sorry you feel that way. That's not an apology. He paused again. We'll follow up after the flight. I'd prefer resolution now. I'm afraid I don't have that authority. Nia nodded once. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture broadly. She didn't need to. She just let him walk away and took note of everything he didn't say. 10 minutes later, Sloane returned with a tablet in hand and a tighter posture. She leaned in slightly, eyes unreadable. Ms. Thompson, I need to confirm something with you. Nia looked up. Of course. It seems our system flagged a discrepancy regarding your booking. Nia raised an eyebrow. Discrepancy? There's a question about how this seat was acquired. It was purchased. Through whom? Starglide Strategic Holdings. Sloane tapped something on the tablet, waited. That name doesn't appear in our records. It wouldn't. Not in yours. Sloane's mouth tightened. We're going to need to verify this with someone in our operations team. Then do that. Until then, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Nia didn't move immediately. She looked toward the front of the plane, then slowly unfastened her seatbelt. She picked up her tote. I assume my belongings should come too? Sloane didn't respond. Nia stood. A hush fell over the first-class cabin. Passengers looked without looking. Phones were lowered. Tablets went dark. One man adjusted his glasses and said nothing. 2 uniformed airline security staff waited at the front. One of them gestured toward the forward galley. This way, ma'am. Nia walked without pause. Her tote bounced gently against her hip. The envelope inside stayed flat. She followed them through the galley, past the cockpit door, and into the jet bridge, where the morning chill had settled again. The plane door stood open. No one else was moving through it. They led her through a side corridor, past unmarked service doors and echoing tile. The hallway curved once, then narrowed. A final door opened onto a small operations office. Inside, a desk, a chair, a terminal screen, and a third man in a charcoal uniform who didn't smile. Please have a seat, Miss Thompson, he said. Nia sat. She placed the tote on her lap. The envelope stayed inside. The man at the desk typed something, then looked up. We're reviewing your ticket history. There's an unusual pathway for this seat assignment. Meaning what? It's listed as an internal override with no corresponding staff code. Because it didn't originate from your staff. Then from whom? From the holding group that controls your route leasing. The man blinked. And your affiliation with them is? Strategic. He looked at the screen again. There's nothing in our system about that. I know. You're saying you're flying under executive privilege? Not exactly. Then what exactly? Something older. He paused. Do you have identification? I do. She pulled a small leather folio from her tote. Inside, a card with a simple logo, no name, no title. Just wait. She placed it on the desk. The man didn't touch it. He leaned closer, squinted, then looked at her again. This is correct. How long have you had this? Long enough. We'll need to verify this. Do that. He stood, walked out, left the door half open. The silence settled back in. Nia didn't shift, didn't look around. She breathed evenly. The envelope inside the tote remained untouched, but its presence radiated. Not in heat, in pressure. Every minute she was out of seat 2A stretched the tension on the plane. She knew it. So did they. Nia sat still as the minutes passed. She didn't check her phone, didn't touch the envelope. The quiet in the room was not awkward, it was constructed, layered, meant to press. She let it press. After what felt like 15 minutes, Sloane returned. She looked slightly more composed, but there was a shift in her tone. A brittleness that hadn't been there earlier. We've spoken with our central team, she said, standing. They're trying to clarify the authorization. Nia didn't reply. There's no clear assignment in our system that explains the override on your seat. Sloane paused. So we're going to offer a reseating arrangement as a courtesy. Business class. Same row. No, Sloane blinked. Excuse me? No. Nia repeated calmly. The seat was issued. The seat is mine. The manifest doesn't reflect that. Then your manifest is incomplete. Sloane's hands tightened slightly at her sides. Ms. Thompson, I'm trying to offer a reasonable solution, and I'm declining it. Reasonably. Sloane drew a breath, recalibrated. Do you understand the position this puts us in? Yes. Do you care? Nia tilted her head, just slightly. Do you? Sloane didn't answer. A knock at the door broke the moment. One of the security staff leaned in, handed a folded note to Sloane, then exited. Sloane read it. Her face flickered. Tension, realization, something like apology, but it was gone in a blink. She looked back at Nia. You're cleared to reboard. Of course I am. Sloane said nothing more. She stepped aside. Nia rose, lifting her tote. The envelope shifted inside but stayed silent. She walked past Sloane without another glance. The security team didn't escort her this time. She walked the corridor alone, her footsteps steady, heels brushing quietly across tile and carpet. At the jet bridge, the ambient noise of boarding returned. Overhead announcements, the rumble of luggage wheels, the soft whine of the hydraulic systems. As she stepped onto the plane, the front flight attendant straightened. Welcome back, Miss Thompson, she said, with a tone that was too smooth to be sincere. Nia didn't reply. She walked past, back to 2A. The seat was still empty. Her water cup was gone. Her tray reset. She sat, fastened her belt. Sloane passed once more. No words, just a glance. Nia didn't look up. She adjusted the envelope in the seat pocket and folded her hands in her lap. The man in 2B gave her a slight nod. She gave none in return. The plane pushed back from the gate. And for the first time that morning, Nia let herself close her eyes. Not in fatigue, but in readiness. The kind that came not from fighting but from knowing the fight had already passed. And she was still seated. Nia sat quietly in 2A as the plane leveled out. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom with an update on cruising altitude and tailwinds. She didn't respond to it. She didn't need to. Her hand rested lightly on the edge of the envelope now tucked neatly in the seat-back pocket in front of her, like she was checking that it was still there, still real. The envelope wasn't thick, but it carried gravity. She could feel it pulling the air around it differently. The cabin had shifted. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Silence had become a character on this flight, hovering just behind her shoulder, watching every blink, every breath, every choice. The man in 2B cleared his throat, then glanced sideways. Sorry if I overstepped earlier, he murmured. I just thought it was odd. That you were skipped. Nia didn't look at him, but she nodded once, slow and controlled. He didn't speak again. Further down the aisle, Sloane stood in the galley with her back toward the cabin, whispering urgently to another flight attendant. They were hunched close over a tablet, reviewing something manifest? Seat history? Or maybe just excuses? One of them kept shaking her head. Sloane's fingers moved quickly, scrolling, tapping. Her neck was stiff. Her tone low but tense. It was too far for Nia to hear the words, but she didn't need to. She recognized the posture of someone trying to get ahead of an answer they weren't ready to face. She turned slightly and looked out the window. The clouds were beginning to thin. Far below, the western deserts of Arizona rippled in quiet lines. There was clarity in that distance. Certainty. A kind of clean that the plane couldn't offer. When she turned back, she saw Sloane approaching again, slower this time, more rehearsed. The smile she wore was painted on, edges uneven. "Miss Thompson," she began, "we just wanted to offer our apologies for the earlier confusion." Nia said nothing. Sloane continued, "There's been a systems issue. The seat you're in was flagged during boarding as a duplicate assignment, but obviously that's not the case. We appreciate your patience." Nia looked at her evenly. "You sure it was the system?" Sloane blinked, just once, then caught herself. "Yes, ma'am. We're confirming that now. And we want to ensure you're comfortable for the remainder of the flight." Then stop circling. Sloane hesitated, then gave a tight nod. "Of course." She turned to go, but Nia's voice followed her softly. "You'll want to check with your director of in-flight operations. There's a letter waiting." Sloane froze for just a half-beat before moving on. She didn't respond, but her gait changed, less confident now, more reactive. She disappeared into the front galley. Nia sat back again. She wasn't angry. Not visibly. But there was weight behind her silence, something older than this flight, deeper than this morning. It was not just about service. It was about knowing she had been expected to shrink and choosing not to. Nia didn't move. She kept her gaze soft, forward, patient in the way only people who had waited through worse could be patient. Outside the window, light filtered across the wing in golden patches. The cabin buzzed with the mundane. Soda cans cracking open, light chatter about connecting flights, a couple in one scrolling silently on their phones. But something else was moving beneath that calm. A second layer. Flight attendants walked with slightly quicker steps. Sloane peeked her head out of the galley more often, not to look at passengers, but to check the aisle. The man in 2B glanced toward her again and then looked away. He didn't say another word. At some point, Nia leaned forward, reached into her tote, and retrieved a phone. Not her personal one, but the firm-issued device. Black, thin, nothing flashy. She unlocked it, tapped through one secure folder, and brought up a document titled Authorization Transfer Tier 1, SGH/Starglide Air. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She just let it sit on the screen, visible as she rested the phone in her lap. The document had no summary, no header, just a digital watermark across the preview that read, "Priority Authorization, Executed." She left the phone unlocked and leaned back in her seat. 5 minutes passed. Then Sloane returned, this time with someone else. The man wore a gray jacket, gold wings pinned to the lapel, and carried a tablet. He was older, with thinning hair and a clipped tone that tried to sound warm but didn't quite succeed. "Ms. Thompson," he said. "I'm James Bentley, in-flight director for Starglide Air Corporate Services. I just wanted to speak with you briefly." Nia nodded once. "We understand there was some confusion earlier, and I'd like to personally apologize. This seat was indeed issued through an executive channel, though it took some time for that information to reconcile with our manifest systems." He didn't look at the tablet as he spoke. He looked at her, carefully, like a man trying to gauge which version of a story would land best. Nia didn't offer him anything. He continued, "You should never have been approached the way you were. That's not how we do things." She stayed silent. Bentley adjusted his stance. "May I ask, are you traveling in official capacity?" "I am," Nia said evenly. "Then you'll know why certain verifications are necessary when protocols are bypassed." "They weren't bypassed," she said. "They were initiated from above." Bentley gave a slow nod. "Of course. A beat. Would you mind if we speak further after landing?" "I would," she replied. "Respectfully, I won't be available for any follow-up." Bentley smiled thinly. "Understood." He turned to leave, but she added without raising her voice, "The document's been time-stamped and forwarded." Bentley paused, nodded once more, then walked away, slightly stiffer than he had arrived. Bentley was barely out of sight when the man in 2B shifted slightly in his seat. He didn't speak right away. He just leaned a little away from her, almost imperceptibly, like he wasn't sure how much space he was entitled to anymore. Nia noticed but didn't acknowledge it. She wasn't interested in distance or comfort. Not now. She reached forward and tucked the phone away, the screen dimming as her hand slipped back into the tote, resting again on the envelope. The energy in the cabin had changed. People weren't talking as much. Pages turned slower. Overhead bins weren't opening. Even the attendants seemed to move with a kind of delayed calculation, as if every step now carried weight. Authority didn't need volume. Presence was enough. At the far end of the aisle, a younger woman in 3A, mid-30s, white blazer, pearl earrings, whispered something to her husband. He turned his head and looked at Nia, then back at the screen in front of him. She watched it all unfold in reflections in the cabin wall, in the black surface of her phone screen, in the glossy curve of the window. The weight of the moment wasn't in confrontation. It was in containment. Sloane made one last slow walk through the cabin, but she didn't make eye contact. Not with Nia. Not with anyone in row 2. Her hands were clasped, the tray she carried practically empty. She moved like someone hoping to pass unnoticed. Nia let her. When the cart reached row 1, there was an awkward pause, a pause that said the performance was no longer working. One of the attendants leaned to the man in 1B and asked if he'd care for a refill. His answer was almost too quick, like he needed to re-establish normalcy. Sure. Water's fine. His wife said nothing. The silence around 2A wasn't hostile. It was careful. And that care, more than the silence, more than the glances, was what told Nia the shift had taken hold. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was now the fixed point everything else orbited. And nobody was sure how long she'd stay that way. The plane rolled forward over open sky, somewhere above the western edge of the Rockies. Sunlight danced off the engine, casting soft ripples across the fuselage. Nia didn't smile. She didn't need to. The calm on her face was not peace, it was precision. She didn't need acknowledgement. She already had position. Sloane stood at the front galley, her posture straighter than before, but her hands fidgeted near the tablet as though trying to find something to do. A second attendant lingered nearby, pretending to organize cups, but her eyes kept darting to the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. It wasn't just awkward now. It was fragile. Everyone up front had felt the shift. Some pretended not to. Others sat in it, unsure how to move forward. The captain hadn't said a word. The intercom had gone silent since takeoff. And Nia remained in 2A, unmoved, untouched, entirely present. She knew the power in stillness, in refusing to rise, even when provoked. Especially when provoked. Around her, the rules were rewriting themselves. That was what made people nervous. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't demanded. But the balance had tipped anyway, and no one knew what would happen next. The seatbelt sign remained off. The sky outside was clear. Somewhere below, desert gave way to mountains. The plane continued west, indifferent to what had just occurred. But inside, something subtle had broken loose. Something that wouldn't go back where it came from. A flight attendant stepped quietly into the galley and whispered something to Sloane. Sloane nodded once, then disappeared behind the curtain. Moments later, a different attendant returned to row 2 with a new water bottle and a wrapped snack. She placed it gently on Nia's tray without a word. Nia didn't touch it. She kept her gaze forward, hands still folded. The gesture wasn't meaningless, but it was late. Across the aisle, the man in 2B finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. I didn't know people could hold that kind of authority. Nia looked at him once, briefly, and replied with calm certainty. Most don't. That's why they test for it. He didn't say anything else. At the rear of the cabin, a passenger rang the call bell. A soft ding. Felt like something re-entering the room. The plane resumed its rhythm, but the rhythm wasn't the same. The plane had just begun its initial descent into San Diego when Nia opened the envelope. She did it slowly, without ceremony, as if she were checking a grocery list, not triggering the shift of an entire corporate organism. The seal broke with a soft tear. She slid the contents into her lap. A slim set of cream-colored documents, each marked with a single gold crest in the corner. She unfolded the top page. Her eyes scanned it without hurry. She already knew what it said. She'd written it. The letter was formal but brief. It confirmed that Starglide Air was to be notified, upon receipt of the enclosed authorization, that effective immediately, for key infrastructure partnerships would be paused pending review by the Oversight Committee. The review would consider alignment with executive equity commitments, frontline treatment metrics, and failure to meet the required 3.7 threshold on the equity protocol audit. Starglide had scored 3.2. Nia flipped the page. The second document was simpler. It was a memo addressed to Brent Carrington, CEO, co-signed by 2 equity audit board members and the strategic holdings director. It noted that the San Diego route, along with 4 international codeshare corridors, was now under provisional hold. Any further contract development would be contingent on an emergency review meeting, with Nia Thompson representing the primary oversight seat. In short, the airline's next fiscal quarter was about to get interesting. She folded the documents carefully, tucked them back into the envelope, and returned it to her tote. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. The descent announcement came on with a soft chime, followed by the captain's voice, calm as ever. But something about his tone had shifted, like someone had whispered in his earpiece just seconds before he spoke. Cabin crew prepared the cabin for arrival. Seatbacks upright, trays stowed, window shades open. Sloane didn't return. Neither did Bentley. The galley curtain stayed shut. Nia adjusted her seatbelt, placed her phone face down on the armrest, and exhaled through her nose. She didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She simply waited. What she'd set in motion was already moving. The room Dana Walsh led her to was quiet, clinical, and off the main terminal grid. Not a conference room, not an interrogation room, something in between. Frosted glass on 2 sides, opaque door, no company logos. It was the kind of space designed to look neutral but say, this isn't for everyone. A tray of water bottles sat untouched on a side table. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something sterile beneath it. Walsh gestured toward the seat. We've allocated 45 minutes for this. That's what your team requested. Nia sat, unhurried. That's more than I need. Walsh didn't sit. She remained standing, flipping open a tablet that already displayed an internal dashboard. You're aware that your boarding was flagged manually. I expected that. We had questions about the channel used. It wasn't unauthorized. No, Walsh said, then paused. Just unfamiliar. Nia nodded once. It's a new channel. You'll be seeing more of it. Walsh tapped something on the tablet, pulled up a manifest entry. You were booked under Tier 1 Override Strategic Equity Review flag. That hasn't been used since the audit expansion. Exactly, Nia replied. And that expansion included Starglide. Walsh looked up. With respect, Ms. Thompson, these designations don't usually result in in-person oversight. They do now. There was a silence. Not hostile. Just quiet enough for the subtext to settle in. Walsh leaned against the table. Is the letter final? It is. Is there room for negotiation? Depends on who initiates it. Carrington's office would prefer to handle this internally. They had their chance. This is external now. There will be fallout. That's expected. Nia didn't shift her voice, didn't harden her tone. She simply answered every line with the kind of steadiness that made rebuttal feel unnecessary. Walsh looked down, then said, more quietly, You could have sent this through channels. I did, Nia said, and nothing moved. So I moved it. Walsh finally sat, posture still upright but eyes a little less certain. The tone in the room had shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Nia didn't press. She didn't need to. She had already brought the conversation to the edge of discomfort without raising her voice once. That was the kind of authority most people never trained for a quiet, centered, and practiced in stillness. She wasn't here to posture. She was here to remind them that some things don't need to be repeated out loud to be understood. I don't think corporate anticipated this would reach your level, Walsh said, choosing each word like it might be held against her later. Nia didn't blink. That's because they assumed oversight only happens after damage. Isn't that what oversight is for? No, Nia replied calmly. That's what cleanup is for. Oversight is what happens before the storm. Walsh exhaled, trying to anchor herself in a room where the ground kept quietly shifting. Her fingers tapped nervously at the tablet screen before she asked, "May I ask how long you've been active under Tier 1 clearance?" Long enough to know which questions not to ask. Her delivery wasn't sharp, it was steady. The kind of steady that implied finality. And the equity review, was this flagged by a specific incident? It was flagged by a pattern, Nia said. And this morning helped confirm it. She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. The weight in her answer did the rest. Walsh leaned back slightly as though trying to take in more air. "I assume you're aware this will initiate a provisional freeze on 4 infrastructure corridors." 5, Nia corrected without hesitation. "We just added a 5th before boarding. That includes San Diego to Narita." "Yes." The confirmation dropped between them like a stone in still water. Walsh sat up straighter. That route was premium. High yield. Nia saw the realization flicker behind her eyes and waited until it took full root before adding, "You'll want to let legal know by 5 p.m. Eastern." Dana nodded slowly, the kind of nod people gave when they realized they'd been reading from the wrong script. The room felt colder now, or maybe just clearer. Less performance. More reality. Walsh didn't ask more questions. Not after that. She closed the tablet slowly, deliberately, and set it on the table between them. Her face held the look of someone recalibrating. Not panicked, not defeated, just readjusting to a reality she hadn't been briefed on. Nia didn't offer her a way out. That wasn't the point. She simply waited, still and grounded, present in a way that made the silence feel like part of the statement. Finally, Walsh broke it. "You'll be contacted by Carrington's office within the hour. He won't reach me. He'll try. He'll get my office," Nia replied, voice level and composed. "And they'll route him to legal." Walsh gave a short nod. "Understood." Then, after a pause, she added more quietly, "Some of us, those of us on the policy side, we've been pushing for this. Just not like this. There's no good version of accountability," Nia said. "Only real ones." She stood. Walsh didn't. She just watched her rise, like someone aware of the weight that remained in the room. Nia picked up the tote, slung it gently over her shoulder, and adjusted nothing. The envelope stayed inside, untouched yet unmistakably felt. There was no need for more movement. The moment had already moved through them. At the door, Nia paused, her hand resting briefly on the frame. "You won't need a follow-up?" she said, voice even but final. "Everything that needed to be said has already landed." Walsh didn't respond. She didn't need to. The absence of objection was its own acknowledgement. Nia stepped into the hallway. It was empty. No escort this time. Just polished floors, silent walls, and the subtle hum of a system slowly realizing it had underestimated the quietest person in the room. 3 days later, Nia Thompson stepped out of a low-slung federal building in Washington, D.C., flanked by 2 colleagues from Strategic Holdings. She didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't need to, the statement had already been released. Succinct, formal, and devastating in its precision. The Oversight Committee had moved faster than expected. For contract families were paused. An emergency audit was triggered. Internal emails from Starglide Air leaked within hours, the most damning of which was a simple screenshot, time-stamped from 3 weeks before the incident, with the subject line, "She doesn't look like Tier 1. What followed was a cascade. Regional hiring metrics, escalation protocols, crew discretion guidelines, all of it came under scrutiny, and none of it looked good. The airline's comms team issued a blanket apology, carefully worded, avoiding her name. It was smart, but it was late. Everyone already knew exactly who they meant. Nia hadn't written a single name in her letter, yet no one reading it had any doubt who it was addressed to. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't need to accuse. She simply turned a mirror toward the room and let the reflection do the rest. Then came the footage. Grainy, shaky, partial, cut off before anything conclusive, and yet, somehow, complete. 2 uniformed officers walking toward a calm black woman in a navy hoodie, asking her to step aside. Her compliance? Quiet and without resistance, standing still as passengers glanced away. The flight attendant returning midair, head lowered, words inaudible, apology visible. No sound, just images. But the silence said enough. That clip went viral, over 2 million shares in the first 24 hours. News segments ran it with overlays and disclaimers. Commentators called it ambiguous, unclear, lacking context. But the public didn't need context. They trusted their instinct. And something in that video didn't sit right. Some viewers assumed she was a celebrity. Others pegged her as an activist. A few guessed she was a federal inspector. But no one guessed the truth. She was all of those things, and more. That was the genius of it. She didn't match any one profile because she wasn't built for categories. She didn't carry herself like a threat. She carried herself like the standard. And that, as it turned out, was the true disruption. On cable news, one commentator called it an elegant dismantling of institutional optics. Another noted, she didn't break the system. She made the system break itself. But the quote that echoed longest came from a sociology professor on local radio. She didn't push back. She didn't escalate. She didn't even name it. She made the system say its own name out loud. That line traveled into comment sections, into corporate inboxes, into boardroom meetings where executives stared at their own policies and realized they hadn't built loopholes. They'd built mirrors. But Nia didn't follow the headlines. She didn't take calls from reporters. She didn't sign on for interviews or accept panel invites. She had work to do. What happened on that flight was just one breach, one visible node in a much larger map she'd been charting for years. She wasn't interested in being viral. She was interested in being upstream. And now that breach had been seen, it couldn't be unseen. Later that week, Nia spoke at a closed-door session convened by the Department of Transportation's Equity Oversight Task Force. There were no cameras, no transcript, just 33 officials seated in concentric half-circles in a high-ceilinged conference room overlooking the Potomac. Tablets and notepads lay open in front of them, but for that hour, almost none were touched. Some attendees had worked in the system for decades. Others were relatively new. But in that moment, they all shared something rare, stillness. Nia didn't begin with policy. She opened with a pause, then a sentence that hovered in the air longer than anyone expected. There's a difference, she said, between being in a space and being allowed to stay there. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. Her stance was composed, her words carefully measured. And yet every line she delivered settled across the room like layers of sediment, unseen but undeniable. You can follow the rules. Buy the seat. Pass the checks. Hold the credentials. And still be flagged. Still be questioned. Still be re-verified. Again. And again. And again. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't need to dramatize the truth. It carried weight on its own. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to register, but not long enough to let anyone escape it. That's not coincidence, she continued, calm and precise. That's design. And design can be challenged. It can be undone. There was no immediate reaction. Just small, unconscious movements, a pen resting midair, fingers hesitating on a keyboard, someone slowly closing their folder as if to hear better. I didn't escalate what happened on that flight, Nia said. I didn't film it. I didn't tweet it. I didn't name it. She paused again, not for drama, but because letting silence do the work was part of her point. I let the design show itself. It was less a speech than a dismantling. She never rushed. She never lectured. She just laid out truths plainly, one after another, like she was unfolding a map people already knew but had refused to trace. When we talk about power, she said, we picture noise. Protest. A fight. A platform. But sometimes power doesn't look like movement at all. Her tone dropped slightly, almost gentle now. Sometimes it looks like refusing to be moved. She didn't point at anyone. She didn't have to. Her eyes moved across the room without accusing, but with a clarity that made many people shift in their seats anyway. Sometimes power is staying seated. The words didn't ring. They didn't echo. But they stayed. No one spoke. Not because they were stunned, but because they understood. Not one person reached for a response. They sat with it. Some nodded. One person reached for their ID badge and just held it. Nia stepped away from the lectern, not to invite applause, not to gesture for recognition. Just to leave space behind her that now felt unmistakably full. She gave a small nod toward the task force chair, folded her notes, and walked out. When the session ended, there was no applause, only the quiet rustle of people who remained seated, some with notes still open, others with hands resting against their mouths, uncertain whether to move or sit still just a moment longer. Nia didn't linger. She didn't search the room for reactions or acknowledgments. She offered a subtle nod, slipped her notes into her bag, and walked out without turning back, as though she delivered something not loud but lasting. In the hallway beyond the chamber, silence met her again. The walls were sterile, the floor cushioned just enough to make each of her steps land sharper in the stillness. She passed by aides near the elevators without glancing in their direction, past a security officer who straightened slightly but said nothing. Her pace was even, deliberate, not rushed, not slow, carrying the weight of clarity, not burden. Outside, the sky was overcast in a way that made the world feel suspended, not dim, not bright, just level and waiting. A black sedan waited at the curb. The driver, tall and unreadable, opened the rear door. There was no conversation, no protocol. Nia simply stepped in, adjusted the front of her blazer, and settled into the back seat, towed across her lap like she always carried it. The car pulled away as her phone buzzed, once, then again in quicker rhythm. The screen lit up with messages from her team, missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, links forwarded by contacts she hadn't heard from in years. Notifications rose in quiet waves, each one pressing forward like the city just outside. She didn't open any of them. She turned her head toward the window. Washington rolled past in a hush of motion. Pale buildings, faded flags swaying in indecisive wind, people clutching coffee, lanyards bouncing against coats. Nothing was visibly different, and yet something in the rhythm of the city felt off-kilter, like its center had been nudged a degree sideways. She hadn't dismantled it, but she had tilted it. At a red light, the car stopped. Across the intersection, under a bus shelter, two men in suits stood shoulder to shoulder, both looking down at a phone between them. She couldn't see the screen, but she knew. They weren't watching a video. They were reading a consequence. In the window's reflection, Nia caught a glimpse of herself, not clearly, not fully. Just enough to register posture, presence, and poise. Her outline was still, her breath even, her expression unreadable but whole. The world might be moving fast now. But she wasn't. She was still. She was unbothered. She was present. There would be statements. There would be debates. Articles. Panels. Pushback. Reforms, perhaps. All of it would swirl and rush and build on top of a moment that had not needed to raise its voice. Nia hadn't tried to become a symbol. She hadn't made a speech for applause. She hadn't raised her voice or called anyone out. She had simply stayed where she was, unmoving, unshaken, and somehow that had made the entire system adjust its position in response. Some would insist she had torn something down. But they'd be wrong. She hadn't dismantled anything. She had made the system look at itself. And for the first time, it didn't look away.